Hello, and welcome to Ipsa Dixit, a podcast on legal scholarship. I'm your host, Brian L. Fry, Spears Gilbert Associate Professor of Law at the University of Kentucky College of Law. My guest is Michael Nesbitt, Assistant Professor of Law at the University of Calgary Faculty of Law. We will discuss his article, An Empirical Study of Terrorism Charges and Terrorism Trials in Canada between September 2001 and September 2018, which is forthcoming in the Criminal Law Quarterly. So welcome to the show, Michael.
Thank you so much for having me, Brian.
So this was a really interesting paper, and one that's very much outside of my area of expertise, not only because I don't really know much about terrorism prosecutions in general, but especially about what the law and sort of law enforcement in that area has looked like in Canada. So I wonder if you could start by just talking about sort of terrorism prosecutions in Canada during that period. Sort of how many people or how many charges were filed, how many trials were held in Canada during that period, and sort of what were they for? What kinds of things were people being prosecuted for?
Yeah, it's a great question. And if you don't mind, I'll just give a quick update for the American audience, because I'm sure they'll think of September 11th, 2001 as the starting date for this. Of course, draw the parallel to the September 11th attacks. And of course, that's a big part of the story. But the reason it's a big part of the story in Canada is because we didn't really have terrorism offenses we have a federal criminal code, so we don't have it state by state for you guys, or province by province for us. So we didn't really have terrorism charges, at least as we see them now, in our criminal code. So those really came into being shortly after and because of the September 11th terrorist attacks. So that was the reason for the starting date. And so when we're talking about the number of terrorism charges and trials since September 11th, 2001, we're really talking in the history of Canada. Mm-hmm. Now, we've had other things we might quantify as terrorism in the past, but those offenses were usually charged, some would be charged in the famous Air India bombing from 1985 is probably the largest terrorist attack involving Canadians, at 329 killed, I believe. But the individuals were charged with murder in that case, not terrorism. So that's really the reason for starting there. And so when I say, I'm going to say there's 54 at the time of the study, and we've had one more charge and the start of a prosecution since. So we're up to 55 terrorism charges in Canada. And that's since September 11th, 2001, but it's also ever. Mm. And the charges we've had so far, and this includes the more recent one, which was last fall, so after the end date, artificial end date of this paper, almost all of them, in fact, all of them except for one, were for what I would call, just for simplicity's sake, Islamist or jihadi inspired terrorism. Mm. And so we've only had one terrorist offense that wouldn't fall into that category, and it was a individual who was sending financing back home to Sri Lanka, and he was associated with the LTTE, the Tamil Tigers. Mm. And that's of interest, one, because this is, a reflection of what's happening in the world, but it's also of interest in Canada because we're seeing a lot of the same things that probably at a smaller scale, but a lot of the same things that we see happening in the US. So what immediately jumps off the page here, and might to your audience as well, is the lack of what we might call far-right extremist prosecutions under the label of terrorism.
Right. So when Canada created the first terrorism charges in 2001, what kinds of potential charges did it create? In other words, what were the options for Canadian prosecutors, or whatever they're called in Canada, for pursuing terrorism charges qua terrorism?
Right. So what we usually do for this kind of, Canada is lovely in some ways in how it approaches many of these criminal charges. So what we don't sometimes do well, I'm going to generalize a little bit here, but what I'll say we don't sometimes do well is be tremendously proactive. So it takes something like September 11th, a real tragedy like that, to happen before we have terrorism offenses at all. Now, the good side of that approach, that's what I call it, the Canadian approach, is when we finally do get around to instituting offenses or thinking about what offenses we could have or how to charge them, how to prosecute them, what's fair, what will protect rights while also ensuring security and prosecution. Usually we have sort of a last mover's advantage, which in business is a bad thing, but in law is a very good thing sometimes. And so what we did was we looked to the US, we looked to Australia, we looked to the UK, and we did, of course, we tailor it for Canada, for our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, for the particular landscape that exists here, but we draw on what's happening elsewhere. And so what we found was, one, we were being criticized and continue to be criticized for not prosecuting, not just terrorist financing, but money laundering and some other money related offenses. So the first charges or offenses we have are related to terrorist financing. Mm-hmm. And then the way we've set it up is we have participation in a terrorist group, although that is not to say being a member of a terrorist group. So you can be a member, but you can't participate. And the distinction is the participation requires some active involvement that forwards the agenda of the group. We have facilitating a terrorist activity. We have commission of a terrorist offense. So most of them were preemptive. This is the one that's maybe the one that's sort of not preemptive is the commission of a terrorist offense for the commission of indictable offense for a terrorist purpose. And then a couple other small ones that haven't been a speech offense, which has never been used, and a couple other lesser offenses that are not used as often. But in general, if I was to give an overview of it, what I would say was the real reason we needed and wanted at the time this new regime for terrorist offenses was we recognized after September 11th that part of the problem here was, look, it's not, we could charge people with murder if they go out and kill people, but that's not what we want to do, because that requires us to act after people have been murdered, which obviously is not what we want, right? So we set up a regime that primarily targets preemptively. So we sometimes say left of bang. So before things go off. So try to get at people while they're still plotting, while they're still participating in the group, but haven't committed the attack, while they're trying to facilitate an offense or finance an offense that hasn't yet happened. And so most of these offenses try to get at that left of bang activity so that we can criminalize and disrupt the activity before it actually takes place and harms anyone.
Cool. Yeah. And so in your paper, you present what you characterize as an empirical study in which you gather, really, as far as I can tell, all of the kind of quantifiable data about the different offenses that have been filed. Why did you initially think, when you started the project, that an empirical study of the terrorism offenses would be helpful? And what ultimately kind of did you see revealed by looking at the kind of landscape of terrorism prosecution in that way, kind of through the lens of sort of the aggregate data about the prosecutions?
Yeah, let me start with a bit of a mea culpa here, which is that I know your listeners won't all be lawyers, or certainly won't all be public lawyers. So what I'll say is, for those listeners, particularly anyone who deals in the social sciences more broadly and does quantitative studies, for example, empirical, this is really, I'm using the term empirical because in public law, counting counts as empirical sometimes, at least in Canada. and that's really, I'm not going too far beyond, there's no linear regression models run or anything like that. But so really what the starting point was trying to get a sense of the landscape in Canada. And this was for two reasons. One was we had almost all our charges have been in the last 10 years. So I figured before things really take off, perhaps if we see foreign fighters coming back from Syria, it would be good to get a sense of what cases are out there, what's happened so far, how this legislation, which was brand new, is now being interpreted. We also, the government follows this, but they don't release it publicly. So we do have a report each year which lists the total number of charges to date, but it doesn't give you any details about them. It doesn't give you what cases they were, what they were charged with, how many charges per individual, whether they were pulled or stayed or went ahead, how many have gone to trial versus guilty pleas. All that sort of information is just not publicly available. And so I thought, well, not just for me, but for anyone studying this, and I know a lot of people when you do national security who are not in law at all, could really benefit from a lawyer collecting that sort of information and giving it to them, and then they can do something really interesting with it. So actually a big part of it for me was sort of getting a handle on the landscape and then hoping that others would come forward and do the really interesting work. That was obviously compounded by the fact that transparency hasn't been great in this area. And so we just didn't have a lot of this information. And the selfish reason was I was getting a lot of media reports about how many Syrian travelers have there been from Canada, how many have come back, how many have been prosecuted. Is this the first time we've prosecuted someone for actually committing an indictable offense for the benefit of a terrorist group, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought it would be awfully nice if I could just refer them to one paper, or at least refer myself to a paper to help answer the question. So it's a little bit selfish, but I also thought of it as a bit of a social good in that regard, in that I can help make sure that any media attention on this topic, which can be controversial, is at least informed from the outset by what's actually happened in Canada.
And so when you compiled this data, which was really fascinating to me, because it did seem to even someone from the outside to sort of show some really interesting trends and reflect kind of clustering of different approaches that the authorities were taking. Sort of what jumped out at you initially after you put the data together?
Oh gosh. There were a lot of things that I was looking for initially that I thought might jump out, but I wasn't sure. So one of them was, and this is getting a little bit technical, so I won't get into the details, but the way our courts have interpreted, at least how I've interpreted how the courts are interpreted, our participation in our facilitation offense there's not a hard line between those two offenses. And so it was one of the things I wanted to see was, well, how are they even, if I'm studying this stuff for, my life, but 2 years really in detail, and I can't really tell you the difference between why you charge one and not the other in a particular case. And I could at a very broad level theoretically, but it sort of breaks down in practice. One of the things I wanted to look at was why are we charging one and not the other? When are we charging together? Why? How are you being convicted from one and not the other? That sort of detail. And I sort of thought, if I was a prosecutor and there seems to be a lot of overlap, and the courts don't seem to worry about the overlap and seem to be willing to convict on both charges, why not charge both all the time? So I assumed I'd see a clustering of those two charges. And also you can imagine if someone's facilitating a terrorist offense, usually think of themselves as part of ISIS, or they're part of a small group, or whatever the case may be, which of course is then going to be participation. But we didn't see that in this case. So that's one of the areas where I'm fascinated to see if someone can come up with a good explanation as to why this. Maybe there is no good explanation. Maybe this is something we're still working through. Some of the other things we noticed, I of course look at things like gender. So when you look at the terrorism offenses in Canada, they're almost all men. That's a little bit surprising to me. One, because about 30%, and I think the numbers aren't too far off in the US, 30% of offenses in general are committed by women. So if I was to guess without any further information, and someone said, how many people of a particular type of offense are women and how many are men, I would guess about 30% are women. We're seeing under 10%, around 10%. They say, well, maybe terrorism is different. But if you look at the international numbers, the estimates are around 25% female. So then the question becomes, well, why is it different for Canada? And I can't tell you why. that doesn't come out. So there's, you could come up with a number of hypotheses here. It could be the landscape is different in Canada. It could be that terrorism is a very serious offense, and the gender numbers look an awful lot like the most serious offenses in Canada. So if you compared them just to murder and sexual assault, for example, the numbers would look pretty similar in that regard. So maybe this is just an offense that's of serious violence that looks a lot like those other offenses. It might also be the case, and this is something that I think a lot of us who are following this, probably not just in Canada, but elsewhere, are a little worried about, which is stereotyping. So this comes up when we talk in national security and terrorism about these individuals who have traveled from the US and from Canada and from Britain and from elsewhere and gone to fight in Syria for ISIS. And so the question for all these nations is, what the heck are we going to do with these people? Do we bring them back if they're in Kurdish custody? Maybe we just leave them in Kurdish custody. Do we bring them back here? If we bring them back, do we prosecute them? What happens with the women who went abroad with men and had babies abroad? What do we do with the kids? What do we do with the parents? Do you bring them back and immediately put both parents in jail and put the child into the system or something? So, and what we're seeing, at least in Canada, and I think this is true in Britain, although someone can correct me, is the individuals who are coming back are often denying their role. Right? So you come back and you say, yeah, but I was just, I was part of the group, but I didn't really do anything really bad. And for a lot of the women, at least in Canada, who are coming back, they say, yeah, but I just went there to follow my husband or something like that. Well, we know that's not entirely true. We don't have stats on what everyone's doing. We don't know what everyone's doing, which is part of the problem. But we certainly do know that any group of individuals that go over, some are going over on their own accord. Just like some men are probably being pressured to go over. Some are participating in fighting, some aren't. And so one of the things that I hope at least we're keeping an eye on is that we don't start stereotyping and that stereotypes aren't driving these. So in other words, we have a low prosecution count against women because we're assuming that women don't have a propensity for violence or aren't committing the violence attacks or aren't seriously involved in the plotting abroad or what we might consider the offenses, that we take each analysis case by case. Another thing that jumps out, obviously, which I've mentioned already, was, look, I knew that most of these charges would be jihadist inspired. I didn't imagine that you'd have 54 of the 55 would be jihadist inspired, and the other would come from a very minor offense of terrorist financing in Sri Lanka, and that was sort of your lowest punishment, and all that sort of stuff. And the reason that looks a little odd is we've had the same problems as the US, though on a lower scale, with this far-right extremism. So we had Alexandre Bork last year went into a mosque and killed 6 people and was arrested. And he was charged with murder of 6 people. And so the question immediately became, and I think understandably so, why wouldn't that be terrorism? He went in, he said he was doing it because he was anti-immigration, anti-refugee. He felt like he had to act. It was pretty clear he was on a number of Reddit pages and other online forums where he was spouting rhetoric, which looks an awful lot like what some people are starting to call the transnational white supremacist movement rhetoric. So why are we seeing a couple of cases like that? And that's not the first one. There's another person in Nova Scotia, who killed 4 RCMP, that's our National Police Force, officers. So the question is why we're not seeing more of those charges. And then I guess the follow-up question would be, if most of these charges are preemptive, which has turned out to be the case, which isn't surprising because that was the intention behind creating the offenses in the first place, why do we have no preemptive action against far right? And again, you don't want to assume an answer. It could just be, unlucky. It's been a short period of time. We just haven't caught anything. It could also be resourcing. It could be systemic. It could be we're not charging the right thing. So who knows? Yeah.
Well, I mean, given your description of the reason for adopting the terrorism charges in the first place, kind of, as you said, looking to the left of the offense, as it were. I mean, it at least suggests the possibility that there's kind of under investigation of certain kinds of what would probably be characterized as terrorist activity, like maybe a focus on Islamist or jihadist inspired potential terrorism, but not on non-Islamist or jihadist inspired potential terrorism.
Yeah. And this is again where, I can't say that for sure. And I try not to assume the worst about people, but the other side of that is the numbers are pretty stark at this point. So I'm asking about it now with
Mm-hmm.
our authorities, and I think our authorities should be asking the same thing. It could be blatant bias. It could be something systemic. So we know, for example, we have language from the mid-aughts saying we took a bunch of money from the RCMP and moved it from hate crimes and other organized crime investigations and over to terrorism. And the question is, okay, if you moved it over to terrorism, did you have something specific in mind? My guess is, consciously or unconsciously, you probably had September 11th in the back of your mind, so you had something particular that you were looking at. And then the question is that really, does that tunnel vision, in other words, is that what been drawing it? And of course, that's very bad from a number of perspectives, right? It means you're discriminating against a particular community. It means you're not doing your job effectively. It's not good for national security either, because it means you've got a huge blind spot to what appears to be a fairly serious threat across North America and the West.
So when you looked at the data, kind of in the aggregate, did the offenses charged tend to be like individual offenses, or did you see like kind of group offenses, almost like conspiracies of some kind, or was it like a mix of the two? What was sort of the breakdown of the nature of the underlying crimes?
Yeah, this is another thing, and I'd have to go back to the numbers in detail here, because I think you're getting at something which I think is really interesting, which is most of the offenses were individual offenses, but they were individual offenses for participating as a member of a group. So almost a third of our offenses came from a plot that is become colloquially known as the Toronto 18 group. And so it was sort of a funny name, the Toronto 18. 18 people were originally charged. They almost immediately stayed charges against 7 of them. I think it was mostly or all youth, which left only 11. And there were actually about 40 sort of peripherally involved. But in any event, we call it the Toronto 18. But that makes up, if you say there's 55 total, 18 of them were from that one plot. We have what we call the Via Rail plot, which is another 3 or so. So most of the offenses seem to come from small groupings of individuals. So that's interesting to me for 2 reasons. One is they're not being charged in Canada necessarily for the participation in a group, and that group is ISIS. They're being charged with participation in the group, and that group is whatever that small group that they've just formed, which might be sympathetic to ISIS or some other group. Might be easier to label them a terrorist group because they seem to be unofficially affiliated with these other groups. But really what we're looking at is small groups of mostly men. So again, that's interesting to me for 2 reasons. One is we don't have a whole bunch of people who are, and I guess this is just the way the recruitment goes internationally, but who are card-carrying members of what you would think of as an international terrorist group. And the other side of that is we don't have many lone wolves. And so if you're getting back to the Bissonnette case, the individual who I just spoke, who walked into the mosque and killed 6 individuals, it seems to be that we're going after groups rather than your lone wolf. And I wonder if that portends a potential future legal or investigative problem with respect to lone wolves as terrorists.
One thing, or kind of from an American perspective, looking at the data that you provided, a couple things jumped out at me. I mean, one was the relatively high number of acquittals in some of these cases. Yeah. And the other was the relatively high number of people who chose to go to trial rather than accepting a plea bargain. And now I don't know the extent to which that would also be the case in the United States. It's not my area, but I do know that from a broader kind of criminal law perspective, going to trial is very much the exception to the rule of taking a plea bargain. So both of those were kind of surprising to me. Are the numbers more consistent with what's typical in Canada? And if not, what do you think might explain it?
So, yeah, I think there is an explanation here. So why don't I start with what I'll call the first of those 2, which is why are so many of these going to trial. And you're right. The numbers are, I don't want to say exactly the same in Canada, but for all intents and purposes, they're the same in Canada. So, most cases never make it to trial in Canada, as is the case in the US for whatever reason. And so you see that breakdown again with certain offenses. So in Canada, we have mandatory minimum sentences for certain things. And so the incentive to plea bargain in those crimes, murder being the prime example, is limited. And so we don't see as many plea bargains in murder. Sexual assault, I think, is another example. And terrorism appears to be another example. Now, terrorism, we don't have these mandatory minimums, so you don't have that same obvious explanation there. What I think might be part of the explanation is, I think there's three that come to mind, and I'm completely open-minded to someone else saying, no, it's actually mostly the result of something else, or there's something I'm not thinking of. But the ones that come to mind for me are, first of all, these are fairly new offenses that haven't been tried out. So we don't know how they're going to be ruled upon, or even if they're necessarily constitutional, at least at the beginning. So you may as well take it to trial and try your hand at getting the charges overturned, or hopefully someone made a mistake along the way, or whatever the case might be. So I'm guessing they're sort of take a shot in the dark in some cases. Another thing that seems to be happening is, and I'm not sure if this is driving decision, but I'm worried it's going to drive decisions, which is that when we get to sentencing, you're seeing about the same sentence for those who plead guilty and those who don't. And if that's true, then you don't have much incentive to plead guilty. And if you don't have much incentive to plead guilty, you may as well take it to trial and fight the charge. Why not? I'm getting the same outcome either way, right? So I wonder whether this tendency to treat terror, it's a sort of an impulse to treat, of course you're going to treat terrorism seriously. Of course you're going to give them harsh sentences. The other side of that, and we've seen this in other contexts, is if you treat them all harshly and the same, then there just isn't this incentive to plead out in some way, which means it's more expensive for the system, which means it takes up more court time, which means you risk a not guilty finding, which means all sorts of other stuff. So I do wonder a little bit whether that, even if it wasn't initially driving things, if that started to drive things. And the final one is, terrorism is about as complicated a offense to make out, I would guess, anywhere. And so I'll just use the Canadian example because that's what we're talking about to explain it. So one, it's difficult because it's preemptive, right? So it's not saying we have forensic evidence to suggest you did it. We have the blood splatter and we have the murder weapon and we have your DNA on the weapon and this sort of thing, right? It's you were planning to do something and we think you were going to sort of go ahead with it. And we're going to need wiretaps and we're going to need maybe an undercover informant to tell us about this. So it's complicated. Whenever it's complicated, it means you can poke holes in it. There might be procedural problems. The police might have made a mistake along the way. In Canada and the US, you might have constitutional problems. There's respect to rights violations, for example. And on top of that, this is that I can think of in Canada, it's the only charge that imports, for the most part, what I'll call a motive clause. So motive is, I think it's true in the US and in Canada, it's really important to proving your case, but it's not necessary, right? So in Canada, you have to prove you committed the murder and you intended to do so, to put it simply. You don't have to show why. Showing why helps. It helps with, I always think of it through the lens of like consonance or dissonance theory, right? So you have a bunch of facts which would tend to suggest an outcome, and you have an outcome you want to get to. And the motive helps you tell that story to connect those two things. Mm-hmm. And so if you're a prosecutor, that story is great because it creates consonance between the story you want to tell and the facts that are available and the outcome you need. And we know that people like consonance and they like a good story. And so that helps lead you to the outcome. So motive is playing a role, but it's not fundamental to the charge. In terrorism in Canada, motive is built into what the Crown has to prove. So they have to prove that not only did you commit the act, say, on behalf of or for the purpose of aiding a terrorist group, but that you did so with a political, religious, or ideological motive. Well, that's really hard to prove why someone did something. So I think that if you're a defense lawyer and you're looking at this, or if you're a plaintiff and you're looking at it, or defendant, sorry, and you're looking at it, you're probably saying, well, I've got more grounds upon which I can defend myself. This is going to be more complicated. Maybe I may as well go ahead with the defense. But as you say, the long and the short of it is we've got a lot more cases going to trial, and so that makes it look a little bit different than anything else really that's happening here. Now, I think your second question, if I can get to that, was related to the conviction rate. And so the conviction rate is more standard. It's at least when I look at the conviction rate, it looks about like the conviction rate for your average other charge. So this is where we sort of say, well, if it was like murder, then it should look like murder in more ways than one, right? If we're sort of saying, the gender makeup looks like murder, so maybe this is a charge that more fits murder. Actually, our conviction rate would suggest it just sort of fits the Canadian conviction rate. The other thing to say there is it depends on sort of how you count this. So when we actually have a very high conviction rate when the cases go to trial. So I think we've had one stay, I want to say, after a guilty plea because of entrapment, police entrapment, and another maybe one or two cases of not guilty. Mm-hmm. But for the most part, if it goes to trial, they're being found guilty. And even if they plead out, they're pleading out, obviously, saying they're guilty. Mm-hmm. But in that way, it's high or maybe even higher than you might expect. So we are actually doing a pretty good job prosecuting. The question, I guess, becomes, what about all those other cases that, the 7 individuals that were against whom the charges were stayed in the Toronto 18, for example? Are those prosecutions are we being too cautious? And that explains why we're doing so well when we get to trial, if you're the prosecutor. Or is it just because we're doing pretty well and those were completely justified stays? And, or there's other reasons for not going ahead with the charges. In some cases we have charges in absentia because individuals have gone off to Syria and we sort of know who they are. They're listed in the paper in some cases. In some cases we think they're probably dead, so we're never going to see anything.
Yeah. Yeah. So Michael, in closing, I wonder if you could talk about what kind of reception the paper has gotten and whether there's been a reaction of any kind on the part of Canadian law enforcement. I mean, for me, one of the many provocative findings or suggestions was that maybe there was a kind of lack of attention being paid preemptively to right-wing activities that would properly be characterized as terrorism. Have you seen any action on that front or any concern from the authorities to sort of think about whether that might be an issue?
Yeah, and you don't want to credit the paper for this. I think there's a lot going on, the paper being the least of the factors that are driving the decision-making now, but you are seeing for the first time, at least that I can remember in the last little while, authorities coming out and saying we have to revisit this. So that's politicians coming out, that's some of the security services coming out. Now, having said that, that's only really recently. So one of the things, as you allude to, I do mention in the paper is, even if you go back 3 years, there was quite the opposition to the proposition that it might be the case that we don't have a full, clear picture of the national security threat, or even that we should be treating both our security services and our National Police Force have statements from very high up from 3 or 4 years ago saying essentially that right-wing extremism is, of course, a problem, but it's a law enforcement problem, not a national security problem. And it's really the ideology is different, and therefore we're going to view it as different from sort of your standard terrorism. I think that's starting to change. Having said that, unofficially, you get some people who say, yes, this was self-evident and sort of obvious, and just follow the budget numbers and look where the money was going in terms of investigations. You would have seen the same thing as what you're pointing out, but we're glad you've pointed it out, and hopefully we'll build on it in Canada. And then you do hear sort of offline others grumbling about no, we were doing the right thing all along. This is there's nothing to the concern raised here that we're looking at the wrong thing. It just bad luck or whatever is the better explanation for things. But I think that's inevitable. Even either they're right or it was tunnel vision, and people don't generally like to admit to tunnel vision. So you're probably not going to change those opinions. But I do think we're starting to see a change in Canada from at least, I don't know what's happening at the ground level, but at least high up, you're seeing a change in tone and tenor from the public statements. And we're starting to talk about having a more holistic view of what terrorism could be. I think that's probably the next step for me in my research and for others that I hope they're following on. I think you've sort of hit on what is probably the most important part here, which is that we need to take this more seriously and then start discussing why this is happening, when it might be justified, when it might not be, and how we can sort of offer a course corrective if that is necessary, which I would tend to think it is. I think is obvious from sort of the paper and my statements today.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much for coming on the program, Michael. It's been a pleasure talking to you, and I learned a lot about Canadian law today.
Oh, good. Well, thank you so much for having me, Brian. I appreciate the podcast and the opportunity to speak with you today.
Something here for you, things to see and do. Something here for everyone. Maybe it's the island, maybe it's the market, maybe the Reno, I don't know.
How I love to take a stroll down along the old streets. I see the limestone buildings and I see the new horizons. What a beautiful feeling, the future and the past, and it makes me feel at home.
Back 300 years ago, long before Canada, for this land we call our own, Kingston was on the way. Now 300 years ago, years that passed and the light has shone. Kingston town is now a city. Kingston is 300 years old. Many years from now, looking back on how I took something and I gave, I will